Writing is about the process. It's about listening and recognizing remnants of your story in the stories of others. When we share our stories with each other, we share the resonance of the human experience. The By Firelight podcast is your invitation to join our circle, a circle of writers, poets, seekers, and storytellers as we capture our living in words. This multifaceted living with joy, grief, love, growth, and loss is shared among us in your legacy, your story. The things you choose to do with your days as they unfold matter here. I'm your host, Betsy Delzer. I'm many things, but in this gathering, I'm a painter, poet, and writer, and I'm honored to be your guide through these episodes. Together, we'll find our muses in the rich and heart-expanding conversations with incredible guests, many who are like minds and all outrageously inspiring hearts. When you press play, you're here in the circle to share this space with us. By Firelight. Percy Brown is a warrior and advocate. He stands for his values, his truth, his bloodline, and our collective history. He's made his living as an educator, district administrator, and leader of equity work, and is a speaker and consultant across the United States. He's in the process of publishing a memoir that threads together the narrative of his story and his family's story under the umbrella of Black history. This is a poignant conversation in an important moment in history. Thanks for being here. By Firelight. Percy Brown, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, BD, for having me. Good to be in the space with you. Good to see you again. I was pleasantly surprised to see you when I saw you back in the forest about a month ago, right? And having that conversation, which led to us being in this space like this morning. So
it's a real gift. Our lives have crisscrossed over, and we'll probably get to that at some point. But before we even get started, to get us really grounded and present here, a question I often ask guests, and I'd love to ask you this morning, is what would your younger or older self want to tell us today?
So, I had to think about that one for a minute, and I guess I'll answer it both ways. And when I think about my younger self, I'll take myself back to high school, my teen years, and even my older self, because I would say between my teen years and just the rest of my life, I will say know thyself while taking the time to get to know other people, right? So know yourself, but appreciate the lived experiences and perspectives of those that you live with and are in community with.
As you were saying that, know thyself, I was kind of thinking about the just collection of years that we both have, both in schools, but also in our lives. And, the decades tick on, right? Is there something a memory that you have that perhaps really was a moment where you got true with yourself, or you really embarked on that journey of this is what this life is about?
I just remember as a kid, and especially as I was getting older and hitting my teen years, just looking back at pictures, having an afro. My dad and we had a handshake. It was called Give Me Five on the black hand side. And it was just the affirmations and reinforcement and being proud of who you are. It's okay to be Black, and actually you should be proud of being Black. I would say that piece right there.
Mm.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, and I'm so excited to talk about your memoir. Has it come out yet, or is it on its way to the world?
So actually, I'm in my final round of edits. I'll be sending that back to the publisher on Monday. They'll put the finishing touches on it, send it back to me to sign off, and then it's off to formatting and then a release. Yeah, it's been a process, but it's been a blessed process and an investment that I will never regret, because part of the book, my writing the book, comes out of regret. I've got my Delta State hat on. That's where I did my undergraduate studies in the Mississippi Delta. And, my grandfather, he was born in 1899, right? So he had this lived history. And I majored in history, right? And I would always say to myself, I need to sit down and interview my grandfather, right? I need to get that history on paper. And he passed away at the tender age of 99, and I never had that opportunity to get more of his story on paper. I do have what he imparted to me, right, as my grandfather when I had those times with him and all of the things that he taught me. But to not capture that was one thing that drove me to write this book, because I did capture my father and my uncle's story, which is situated in the Mississippi Delta in the 50s and 60s. So, yeah.
Well, let's just go a little bit into your story, who you are. I recently had this kind of bizarre experience. My dad is still alive and well at the time of this recording. He's 84, but he's really got this like fascination with Chat GPT. And and we've been kind of co-authoring his obituary. He just wants to be prepared, but he's thinking a lot about his legacy, you know? And I was thinking about our time together, Percy, because you strike me as somebody who considers your legacy maybe even on like a daily basis, right? Like I feel like you think a lot about the life that you're living, but the life that you're leaving, and to the point of like kind of what you're talking about, you know, of like wanting to capture the story. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever written your obituary, but I'm just in the space of like kind of capturing a life along with AI and my dad. But what is it like for you to just kind of peel back and think about your life as a whole? What do you want to tell us?
Okay, well, first of all, you brought up the word legacy. So I'm in my office right now. Let me turn around and read this for you. Where's it at? Oh, yes, over here. Right above a picture of my dad, myself, and my grandfather. It might have been when I was graduating from college at Delta State. But above that, I have a framed picture, and it says legacy. The story you leave behind for others to tell. The impression you make on the next generation, not comprised of money or material things, but of character, conviction, and compassion. And I actually had to incorporate that right up top of chapter one of my book. And so it is a self reflection of my life, you know, dating back to when I was born in Madison, Wisconsin in 1974, and thinking about all of the things around me that helped shape me to become who I am today. And a lot of that was growing up on the south side of Madison, growing up in the Black church, growing up with the Southside Raiders, which, you know, has a legacy on the South Side, you know, 50 years. And back then it was pretty much an all Black team going up against, you know, the all white teams across Dane County, from Stoughton to DeForest and the Middletons of the world. And then spending summers in Mississippi, learning so much in the deep South, you know, doing carpentry work at 11 years old. My grandfather taught me how to drive at 12, just all of that. And hearing and learning about my family's participation in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s in the Mississippi Delta, growing up in the Black church in Madison, which had a membership of civil rights activists that were doing work here in the North. One of the pastors was Reverend James C. Wright. They have a school named after him in the Madison School District. And so it's really those experiences, and even going into predominantly white schools and being in community with white kids from, you know, backgrounds of higher socioeconomic status than myself. I mean, culturally, right? I mean, the life that they were living and their experiences were different than, you know, me and my homeboys growing up on the South Side. But having those cross cultural experiences and understanding what all of that meant. But when I was going into those spaces, you know, always going in wanting to make points of connection. Although we may have been different in a lot of ways, I always believed that when I was in those spaces, I could always find points of connection, and leveraging that to start building relationships. So the book gets into all of that, but the book is also about Black history, right? Because I am a historian. I love Black history. Black history has been omitted from the curriculum. It's under attack. It's always been under attack. People just don't realize that. And so while the book is layered with personal narrative and my family's story, it's also guided by an overview of Black history. I even go back and touch on African history. I give folks a kind of a bird's eye view of Black history over a 7,000 year period. And when you look at it in that context compared to our experience here in the United States of America, right? I mean, Black history here in America is just a blip in terms of the broader picture, right? And so there's that alongside, you know, American history and policies and legislation that was passed that influenced the social, political, and economic makeup of how Black Americans experience life here in the United States of America. I researched and really wanted to be factual with the information that I used and wanted to lay it out in order for people to better understand Black history from a world history perspective, but then really drilling down and providing an overview of Black history here in the United States of America, but layering it with personal narrative and personal perspective, right? And I try to layer it so much that even every chapter there is a quote from a Black scholar that can then lead you into deeper readings, right? And so when you get the book, there's a QR code and you'll have access to those resources as well, right? So it's not just my story. It's not just an overview of Black history, but I'm also offering you, the words and the voices of Black scholars and activists. So it's loaded, but it's really designed for people to self-reflect, right? Getting back to that knowledge of self, I've got a couple of self-reflective activities where I just want you to go inside yourself, learn more about your own family history as I take you through this journey of Black history, but then really trying to personalize it through my lived experience and through my family's lived experience. But in all of that, where can we find common ground and grow ourselves in our shared and collective stories?
There's so many directions to go with this, and I'm so excited about it. It's coming through really clearly what an educator you are and historian. But before we kind of go into the technical aspect, I'm wondering if I recall, did you make a trip over to Africa recently? Is that part of your story? Did you go to Egypt?
Yeah, and in July of 2023, I went to Egypt on a 2 week study tour with, I would say, about 125 other Black Americans. Intergenerational. It was led by Anthony Browder. He calls himself the memory recovery specialist, right? And there's an African phrase called saying kofa, which means go back and fetch it, which really is, letting us know as a people that we have to go back and reclaim our history, right? That history that was taken from us when we arrived on the shores of America and going through that process of having our native tongue, our history, our culture, our ways of being, just being stripped from us. And it's there, right? Even though it was stripped from us because of our experiences, it's still there. It's coded in our DNA, right? But we have to reconnect with the DNA by way of reconnecting with our history, right? And then we start to remember, who we were, getting back into knowledge of self before we went through this experience. So, I mean, Betsy, oh, wow. I've read on ancient Egypt. That's going back to my childhood. I don't know what it is, but I've always been fascinated. I mean, ever since I was kid, I can't even explain to you why. I was even into movies like the Mummy and all that, right? Because it was set in ancient Egypt, even though it was very Eurocentric in terms of the actors and actresses, but just fascinated to that point where I was even able to say, well, I know the portrayal is not true, or we can debate that. But to be able to go and see it for myself and the books that I read, we actually had to read books before we went, right? I mean, it was Betsy, it was that deep, right? Even with reading two or three books when you're there, it's almost overwhelming in a way, right? Because you have your own ideas that you're coming in. You're mind blown by the architecture, the pyramids, Abu Simbel, the step pyramids going into the Valley of the Kings. There's that. But then as I was there, and it was something I never even thought about, when you get there, you see the origins of the civilization, right? Which goes back, 4 or 5 thousand years. But then you also, if you have the right people, they then show you when Christianity came in. And they show you historically how those ancient worship temples became churches, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, I never even thought about that. But then from there, around, the 7th century, around 746 AD, when the Arabs came over, that's when Muslims took control over Egypt. And so now you see how they've built upon what the Christians had, but what the Christians had before the Christians were, the ancient Egyptians. And I forgot about the Greeks and the Romans because that history is also layered in there, right? And so it wasn't just Egyptian, it was Greek history, it was Roman history, it was Christian history, and Islamic history. So think about that. On top of the architecture, being on the Nile River, reconnecting with the motherland, Betsy was, I'm a changed man.
I believe it. I believe it. One thing you probably or may not know about me is that when I was studying abroad in Jerusalem in college, I spent some time in Egypt. And I can relate as you're talking about all of the memories of just a lot to what you're saying. I think for me, it was the origins of civilization combined with modern day, right? So like traffic and, just the things that made Cairo the city. And I did travel to Luxor and up the Nile. But when you're there, I'm wondering about I just know you are a spiritual person, a spiritual man, but like, was that just next level when you were there to be in certain places? I mean, did you feel like your heart was just ripping out of your chest?
I was enhanced,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll give you a couple of examples. So Abu Simbel, Temple of Ramesses, great, the four big. So there's a steep hill that you have to get up. You have to walk up, right, when you're done going into the temples. And I would say it's probably about between a quarter of a mile and a half a mile. Right. I was having such a spiritual experience. It was like 115 degrees, but for some reason, that 115 degrees didn't bother me. It felt like I was being empowered. Well, I've always told myself I'm a child of the sun. Betsy, I mean, my knees are not the best, but I said, let me see if I can sprint up this hill. I sprinted that hill. I even passed a little golf cart that were taking people up because people couldn't even walk it. I ran it. I wasn't even running at the time, right? So that like confirmed something for me right there. So that was kind of a physical experience that I can share, right? But on the spiritual side of it, I feel like I left there understanding and being more connected to the human family. And I would say, being connected to the human family in terms of energy, vibration, sound. Like I feel like I have this now sixth sense, right? That when I'm around people, I can feel your energy. I can feel if you're in a positive space or negative space, right? I felt like I've always been a vibe person and could, feel people like that, but I truly feel like it's been enhanced now. And I try to make my family more aware, right, of their energy or their chakras. Right, because when you have your chakras in balance, you can get on that level like that where you can feel the energy that's coming from people, right? Or as you're feeling it, what do you do to counter that with that positive energy, right? And or how do you make sure that you're bringing that into the space of the people that you're with and around, right? And just being more mindful and aware that even though it's hard to get there, right? And that's why when you are in moments of isolation, whatever may be pulling away from that type of energy, try to grapple and deal with it in isolation and in your own space in the way that you need to do it, right? So that when you're, in community with the rest of humanity, right, you can have what you need to be able to bring that right energy, which I just think, makes it better for everybody. So I will say, yeah, that right there is something that I think has made me a better human being, right? Because I've self-reflected on all of that, and I am more intentional, right? Regardless of what's going on around me or how I might be feeling when I'm in the midst and with other people, I have to be the best version of myself for them.
You're talking about vibrational frequency, which is totally up my alley. A number of times I exercise for my frequency, I eat for my frequency, like I create spaces to enhance frequency. So you're definitely preaching to the choir here. I'm curious, as we kind of take this journey back from Egypt back to America, and you're coming home, was it hard to kind of recalibrate or reacclimate to like life in suburban Wisconsin after after running up that hill with Ramsey's energy, or did it kind of translate naturally for you?
Well, actually, this is what happened. I so flew back overnight, got to DC at like 5 in the morning. My flight, like I was able to fly out the same day, and I got back home. I think that afternoon, like 1 or 2 o'clock, and I was on such a high. I was on the high was crazy, Bessie. This is how crazy the high was. I get back. I don't even know if I really slept that night, but that next morning, I'm like, I'm about to go play 18, right? Yeah, that's how I was feeling, right? The golf course it's raining, but I play anyway. It wasn't a heavy rain; it was a light rain, right? So I did that. I get home. I'm still on this crazy high, right? Cut the grass. The high does not come down, right? And so I'm like, let me go ahead and get ready to crank up the grills and grill a little bit. And Bessie, and all of a sudden, like my body went into shock.
I believe it.
I mean, it was so bad that my fingers started locking up, right? I felt like my whole body was on fire. And no, seriously, my wife had to take me to urgent care. It was that bad, right? And she's taking me there. My fingers are just like, and I'm like, I can't move them. She's like, oh my God, right? Get to the emergency room, right? They run my vitals, everything's fine. But then, they take me back after about, I don't know, I think we had to wait like 3 hours. So ultimately I was dehydrated. So they put me on IV for a while, and then they sent me home, right? And so I'm on this crazy high, and I guess I forgot to drink water, but I think at that point water wouldn't have even been good enough, and so that's the type of high that I was on, Betsy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where I couldn't even come off of it, right, until my body forced me. My body, because what I experienced, I had never experienced before, right? So I hit the wall. But coming back from that, there was just so much to process, and my family members and my barber and others, man, tell me about it, right? And I could only share nuggets, right? And fast forward, and it's almost 2 years later, and I'm still processing all of it because I had to get back to my day to day life. But I've got pictures that then can take me back to the literature I've read. I expanded on my literature when I was out there. When I do that, it's easy for the memories to come back, right? And then to help me develop a deeper understanding of what I experienced. And so, that process there is still in play. But, the other part of going to Egypt was Tony Browder, right? And I think I touched on it at the beginning, right? Black history in public schools, Black history in institutions of learning. It's not there. It's not there, right? And it's under attack, right? 18 states have already passed bills restricting the teaching of race, not bills, they're laws, right? And in the United States of America, when we're talking about United States history, you cannot teach Black history without teaching about race, right? And I'm not even saying racism, without teaching about race. And so the history's been dismissed. There honestly has been a whitewashing of history, right? In K-12, our students, regardless of who they are, they get a heavy dose of slavery, right? They don't know anything about the African empires that existed in Africa, for 7,000 years leading up to the transatlantic slave trade, right? So when you start somebody's history there and omit all of that, right? Not only does that not set up Black children to develop themselves psychologically, especially around building their self esteem. Maslow, you know about Maslow, right? Like self esteem needs to be part of the learning process. And if you're starting somebody's history there, you're putting them at a disadvantage, right? But even for the white child, they're learning that, wow, somebody that looked like me back in the day, I used to own Percy, somebody that looks like Percy. right? And that's their foundation in terms of how we see each other within the human family based on skin color, without it explicitly being about race. But to get back to the trip, so Tony Browder was like, look, you've had this transformational experience. Hopefully, I've helped you recover some of your memory. And now that you've had this experience, you've got to take it back, and you have the responsibility to now spread it back in your community, right? If schools are not doing it, you should feel an obligation to start setting up, study circles so that you can give this knowledge back to the community, right? And so, I'm doing some of that in the force, but ultimately for me, it's the book, right? Because, I know I have to continue to give it to my people, right? But this history is human history, right? And so everybody's got to get it, right? And so that part of Egypt is what inspired the book.
That is, yeah, that's profound, and I can't wait to read and see the way that is interwoven. One thing I'm curious about is thinking about just like pulling back into the technical of the book. From a technical aspect, like you've got this great big rich story, multifaceted story, plus you're adding in these elements of Black history. How did you I'm thinking of the people who want to write a memoir or are thinking like, where do I even begin? Like, how did you find a theme? Did you find, did you know what you were wanting to go for? Or tell me about that. And you use the word blessed as a process. I'm so curious about it.
Writing, it hasn't always been, but I would say, I don't know, probably when I finished my master's degree in 2010. Right. A few years after I got my master's, doors started opening up for me to speak publicly. And then a few years later, I started my consulting business, which then opened up more opportunities for me to engage and teach, by speaking. Right. And so growing in that, you know, I feel so good and confident about myself as a public speaker and as a teacher, as a motivational and inspirational speaker. But it came at the detriment of writing. I have finished all of my doctoral work as far as my coursework, but now I had to write, right? And I stopped the process because I started my consulting business. And so then that became my primary focus, writing. I'm like, man, I'm not going to sit down and try to write this dissertation because I'm having all of these opportunities. And it wasn't even about money, being able to go to institutions of higher learning to speak to faith-based folks in their churches, school districts across the country, being in community with other human beings from different spaces and places, right? I'm not going there just to pass on information or teach, but I also want to learn from the people that I'm in community with, right? And so I couldn't stop that. And in all of that, psychologically, I lost confidence in writing. And I was pursuing an autoethnography for my dissertation. And unfortunately, the school that I was in, they really didn't have anybody that had expertise in helping develop what that would look like, right? And so all of that, I just stepped away, and it was actually when Dana in Middleton gave us some journals. It was April 26, 2022. I wrote down in the journal as my morning reflection. I wish I had it on me. It's somewhere in here. But anyway, I said, I am going to overcome my weakness, which is writing, by writing a book to inform the people. That was my morning reflection in my journal, April 26, 2022. And then almost to the day, 2 years later in April, there was a publishing company that saw my website. They saw some of, recorded videos on YouTube or whatever. They were just like, you have a very interesting story. Have you ever considered putting it into a book? And I was like, oh, wow. you know. And so I reached out to them, and the process started, right? And so in the technical aspect or realm of it, it was difficult, right? I knew I wanted to share my story, but more importantly, my family's story, right? This is the other thing. I've got cousins in Mississippi that are educators, right? And so my grandfather was an educator for like 50 years. two first cousins that are more like my brothers that were educators, right? My Uncle Charles, who I interviewed, he worked at Madison College or MATC for over 45 years, right? So there's a rich history of just education. And I found out while interviewing my dad and my uncle that I also had great aunts and uncles that were educators. But in doing my research for the story, for the book, I found out that in Mississippi, the prominent blacks or the middle class blacks, the only job that would put you in that category in Mississippi back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was being a school teacher, which meant that there was some limits to what you could do, right, to enter the middle class, right? And so there's that, but I really wanted the book to lay out an overview of Black history using perspectives of the founding fathers, some of our presidents, elements of the Constitution, and how that really shaped the social, political, and economic landscape for Black Americans, right? Just saying, hey, this is what was put in place. Here is the thinking of some of those that were leading during that time period, right? And in that, talking about, how Black folks were persevering, the things that created the struggle, what that struggle looked like. And in that, really then trying to drill it down even more by adding that personal narrative, right? Because I've been able to trace, my father's side of the family back to 1823 in Louisiana. And what I don't know is if my great 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 grandfather, Taylor Holden, was ever enslaved. I did find some documentation in the US Census that could point to that. But back then, prior to, so the census is every 10 years, right? 1860 was the last one before the Civil War. So, in 1870, that's when, for the first time, Black folks in the country, in the census, they actually had your name with your age, gender, and race. But before that, if you were Black, it was just you were Black, female, and age, right? So that was an example of second class citizenship. Even if you were a freed Black, your name was not included in the US Census, right? And so, 1823, that's over 200 years in America. I think that, should bring some validity to the book. And I did find out that my great 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 grandfather, Taylor Holden, actually worked for the Freedmen's Bureau during the entire period of Reconstruction. He was employed by them from 1865 to 1877. Right. And that was the period right after the ending of slavery. And so to be able to have personal history that goes back that far, and especially today, Betsy, I can't even lie. It's kind of crazy that the book is about to come out right now. Like I said, 18 states, right? DEI totally decimated at the federal level, all because, any discussion on race has been tabooed and boogeyman and called as critical race theory. And so for me, it's like, okay, if that's what we're confronting right now, how can I be historical, factual, while providing perspective? Like the title of chapter one, or the quote, is from Frederick Douglass. He was in Rochester, New York, the 5th of July in 1852, in front of about 500 or 600 white people. 1852, right? The title of his speech was "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," right? And that really sets the tone for the first chapter, which I really get into European history. So chapter one is European history. I have to go into European history in order for people to understand the whole and real concept of race. We are so naive and ignorant to race, what it is, where it comes from, how it plays out in reality today. When, if you understand the truth about it, right, we have an entire world and a belief system, whether we want to believe it or not, that is built in mythology and pseudoscience, right? And if we don't deal with that, I mean, you can say you're colorblind all you want to. That's not true because you don't understand race in itself. The fact that we're even talking about race is racism. I mean, that's how deep it is, right? Like,
yeah.
but just really trying to lay it out that way, but trying to give it some validity by way of personal narrative, and really getting people through the introduction to first open up their minds and embrace perspective taking, right? But if you can open your mind to perspective taking, I also want you to look within and learn more about yourself, right? Where does your story start in the United States of America? Because we are a nation of immigrants, right? For many domestic Black Americans, they're not part of that theme. Most domestic Black Americans can't say that they came in as immigrants. It was forced immigration, right? It was enslavement for 246 years. And so immigration really isn't our story like that, right? And so, how about the first generation immigrants that are here today? What's their story? How much do they know about the history of this country before they came here, right? Because you have to look at it like that. If your story in America starts in 1980 and you have no understanding of America's story before that, how you see things, you can easily be misinformed or misunderstand or not understand a lot of why things are going on the way that they're going on, right? And so we need to have that conversation. I think the gist of it is I hope that people, when they read this book, right, they learn more about themselves while taking on this whole idea of perspective taking, right, and helping them better understand what we're seeing today, because what we're seeing today is interesting to say the least.
It is true that our pathways are never linear. They're messy. And, you think of like sort of the adaptive model of just a tangled web. But I'm thinking about how exhausting and disappointing the erasure of Black history can feel on many, many levels, physically, emotionally, psychologically, right? Like it just strips us down in a way and in different ways, given the vessels that both you and I have been given and then those of our listeners. I'm wondering about when you are in a state as far removed from that vibrational high that you were on coming from Egypt, right? When you are in a state where you are feeling worn by the current events, by the past events, by the future events, whatever it may be, what is it that allows you to kind of pick back up? What is it that allows you to kind of re-engage and find hope again?
So for my physical well-being, it's golf, and that's why the winters are brutal on me. On top of being a child of the sun, I deal with seasonal depression, but golf is always something that allows me to build myself back up. Prayer and meditation is always, it's always there. It's foundational for me. That's how I was rooted, right? It's in my family. It's just in who I am and what I believe. So I say golf, meditation, prayer, and just knowing that I'm standing on giants, right? I know what my father and his brothers and sisters went through, right, in the Mississippi Delta, walking into an all white school, protesting, marching, dealing with intimidation, the threat of death and violence, right? They dealt with all of that and they survived. But also knowing my broader history gives me strength, and that's the title of the book, right? Strength through generations, faith, love, and education, right? I mean, basically, I've given the blueprint that way in terms of what has been for me. But I also think, again, if people read this book and self-reflect, I think that those are values that if they embrace, it can make us better in terms of our shared humanity, but could also leave you in a space where every day, when you walk out and you're in community with people, you're trying to be the best version of yourself. And so I would say, the strength has come through my family history, Black history, which is generations, my faith, being a person of love, right? And I guess lifelong learning, right? And lifelong learning is about, when you're in community with people that are different than you, go in with the mindset of wanting to learn more about who they are and what their story is, right? Because it just make you stronger. So that's it right there.
As you were sort of thinking about your answer, one of the words that came to me that in knowing you, it was also community. You build community where you go, you lead communities wherever you are. And that word really seems to also be something that can allow for radical rest, but also allow for just upholding each other, right? Through the process. Who is a champion that like this story would be a totally different story? Your life would be a totally different life that you're leading. Somebody who this story would just not be the same without.
Before I answer that, and you might have to ask me one more time that question right there. But when you said community, right, that made me, I forgot about that piece, right? As far as making sure you have the strength to be the best version of yourself. And when you put community into the space, I immediately went back to, I would say, 2015 leading up to the pandemic, the community of educators that I was working with in Middleton, right? That was an unbelievable community. There was just strength in that community for me because I could always be in that space as my authentic self. I didn't have to wear a mask. I didn't feel like I had to code switch or play this game. And to be able to have that and to at times, right, like get real with each other, right? Like family. I mean, you were there in those spaces, right? I mean, we didn't always agree. And sometimes when we disagreed, I mean, we were speaking to each other, right? Or we could put our emotions on the table, right? Because I think we did intentional work where we built a community where I know that there was love for each other, right? And we were aligned in what we were trying to accomplish. And we knew that in that we were going to have to deal with outside folks that may not like some of the decisions that we were making, but even in our own inner space,
Mm-hmm.
we had to deal with that. I don't know how many circles we had to have to restore things, right? But ultimately, I would say, kids benefited from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I just had, man, I thank you for saying community because I can't forget that time period. That honestly, I've been an educator for over 20 something years, and I will say that time period right there, it felt like a movement. And maybe I'll stretch it and even go back to like 2013. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there was roots planted there, but man, it felt like a movement.
Mm-hmm.
It was something else. When you're working with people like that, you don't lose strength, right? You don't. I didn't feel drained as intense as that stuff was, right, on top of things that were going on nationally, right? That's when we started to see Trayvon Martin and all of those things. And for a minute it was just me, and then it was just me and Rainey, right? And yeah, that was a moment. That right there was a moment. And I actually have that in the book too.
Mm-hmm. That was it was a really special era for me too, being on your team and working with you, working with our colleagues, and the deeply rooted commitment to anti-racist education, but anti-racist living. And the examination, our roles in the work were by default very different, but also by intention. And one of the things, I asked a question around like champions that make our story. One person for me is George Mavrolis, because when I look at my career in this era that you're speaking of, he was at the end of this very long and rich career in education. And he was really focused on a couple of things. He wanted to prioritize the well-being of our children and our adults, and he wanted to prioritize liberation in the way that he could, right? And so
Right.
bringing in people, making very intentional. I mean, if you remember, our meetings would start with learning, they would start with connection.
That's right.
And that is the space I think that both you and I feel most alive, right? It's like,
Yeah, oh yeah.
that's something that he did. Is there, besides George, because I know he had an impact on both of us, but is there someone else who's maybe a champion of your work or a champion of your story who this book would not be without?
Absolutely. And I think the people that I'm about to share, I hope will be inspirational to anybody who reads this book, right? This book is my story. It's my family story layered, with Black history. And Black history is really under attack right now. But I know that while I was raised by a strong Black family, I was raised in a strong Black church. I was raised in a strong Black community, both in Madison, South Madison, and in Mississippi. While I had all of that, I can honestly say that there are several white men in my life that provided mentorship, that provided opportunities for me to develop and become the person that I am today, right? And it started in eighth grade, actually sixth grade. Paul Bishop, white guy at Cherokee Heights Middle School. For some reason, he read my test scores coming into sixth grade, and there was one other Black girl, and talked to my parents and had us in advanced reading and math classes, right, throughout middle school. And what was crazy about that, right, those are two core academic subjects. And it was just me and her all the way through, right? And so while, we may have benefited from it, there definitely was like some isolation, right? Because I wasn't really amongst my peers. They were dealing with disproportionality and special education. Some of them weren't even in general ed, right? And so there was that piece, but he put me in those classes, but then in eighth grade, and I don't know how he knew, right? Because the Black church also was my kind of place to develop my public speaking skills. It all started in the Black church. But Paul Bishop was like, "Hey, you should join the forensics team." And I'm like, "Well, what is that all about?" And he's like, "Well, you can say speeches." And I'm like, "Oh, for real?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." And so I got into the speech category with the forensics team in eighth grade, and I memorized Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And I won regionals and got to state, competed in three categories. I won one category and took second in the other two. And so Paul Bishop opened up opportunities for me that, you know, if he didn't see something in me, I'm not having that experience. Now, fast forward, I'm an undergraduate at Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta. I'm in a U.S. history class, me and my roommate, another Black American brother. He pulls us to the side one day and talked to us about history, right? And he was like, if y'all major in history and go and get your master's and your PhD, you'll be able to write your own ticket because there are institutions of higher learning where you are not seeing any Black people teaching. So he saw something in me and my roommate, right? And so I'm like, all right. And he ended up being our advisor. And I went and pursued my BA in history. Now, my first job in education was given to me by Bruce Diamond. May God rest his soul. And so I started as a counselor, as a student and family engagement specialist, right? The roles that we got created in Middleton, that was birthed out of my experience getting my first job in education at Madison Memorial. All I had was a history degree. But like the second day I was there, Betsy, he pulls me into his office and he was like, "Man, I think you'd make a great administrator one day." He was like, "But you will have to think about going back and getting your master's." And I said, "Bruce," I said, "don't worry about it." But before I went and got my master's, I had to get my teaching license in Broadfield social studies. And so that spring semester, after my first semester at Memorial, I enrolled in my teacher certification program at Edgewood and rolled all the way through until I got my master's. And the other thing that Bruce did for me that was so instrumental. Not only did he take me under his wings, right, but he immediately put me on the instructional cabinet. I knew nothing about teaching, right? So I'm in the space with these department heads. I'm like, oh, it was a little intimidating at first, right? But once I got into school and started taking classes, my learning accelerated, right? Because I was taking textbook and being able to put into application being around other department heads, right? And so I just gave you three white dudes, and I got two more. Then comes Don Johnson in Middleton. I was working in the Madison School District, right? Did everything that I needed to do, right? Got my teaching license, got my master's. I'm ready for assistant principal or something like that. And I'm a K-12 product of the Madison School District. And Black males, I don't know, for decades have been the lowest performing subgroup in the district. For whatever reason, Betsy, I applied, I get all the way to the final round, and I got nixed, right? I never got the job. And so literally I go on weekend, and it's the last day of the posting of the dean position in Middleton. I applied. I get it. As soon as I get the job, people in Madison find out about it, right? People that I knew on the school board. Percy, what's going on? I said, do y'all know how many times I've tried to, grow as an educator in the system, and y'all have closed the door on me like Betsy literally like 7 times. And so, now they're trying to talk to me, but then I emailed Don and I'm like, hey, I love that you all have offered me the job, but Madison's trying to keep me. And he emailed me back and he said, can you come into the high school tomorrow? So he came. So I went in the next day, and he sweetened the offer. Right? He was like, "You should feel like LeBron James in free agency," and I'm like, "No, not LeBron. It should be Jordan." But anyway, right? And what he ended up doing was he added 20 days to my contract, right, to start doing some work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it was 20 days added to my dean contract, and so I felt that the district was invested in me, right? They weren't playing games, and so it was easy for me to say, Madison, I don't care what you offer me, right? Like what Don did for me, I was like, I have to make the move. So Don created that opportunity, and then 2 years later, they created the allocation for the position to be full-time administrator, director level. And then George, when he came in, I would have to say is the fifth guy, where they allowed me to grow my leadership. They allowed me to expand, right? Don and George, as I was starting to, have invitations to speak at conferences and stuff like that, they were like, Percy, go and do your thing, right? Like we love to see you flying and spreading your wings. That doesn't happen a lot, especially when you talk about history, historically, the white man has been the one that's been the greatest oppressor of Black people, right? And so people might get my book and come in with that mindset where Percy's about to blast white people and make white people feel bad for being white. But at the end of the day, no, I can point to 5 individuals, 5 white males in particular, that I can honestly say because of my relationship with them, and because they actually saw things that I hadn't even seen in myself yet, allowed me to become who I am today in terms of being an educator, the opportunities that I've had, right? Like I had the core, right? I had it. I had community, family, church. I had all of that. But I know even with all of that, right, without them, I might not be where I'm at today. Right. And so, people can say whatever they want to about the book. They need to give it a chance. And hopefully they will know more about me. Right. I'm also in an interracial marriage. I have a daughter that's biracial, right? And so hopefully they could see the human being in me and see that, I'm not this person trying to push some anti-racism campaign, but really trying to bring us together and understand that, we're distant cousins. Our origins are the same, right? Modern humanity has its origins in Africa. And then over the last 100 to 150,000 years, we've migrated and have populated the earth. But at the end of the day, that mitochondrial DNA from that first woman, we all have it. And so we're distant cousins. And so rather than allowing social constructs based on skin color and physical characteristics to define who we are and to divide us, if we can break those shackles, it will transform who we are as a human family. And I hope the book can help people get to that space, find ways to connect, see the strength in people, and see how you can grow the person that you're with, right? And if there are people that are absent from your story and your experience, what are you doing to be in those spaces or invite them into your spaces so that we can better understand our shared humanity while knowing, we all have our own lived experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives. But in the spirit of human family, we come from the same beginnings. If we can get there and make those points of connection, I just think it can transform our experience, Betsy. So 5 white guys.
I love it. I love it so much. So the name of the book,
Strength Through Generations, is the title. And the subtitle is Black American Families Fight for Equality Through Faith, Love, and Education.
and we anticipate that people can have it in their hands when?
hopefully the second week of February. They say once it goes to formatting, it should be a pretty speedy process. So I would say anytime during Black History Month, right?
I love that.
Anytime during Black History Month. Yeah.
Well, deep congratulations on that. Where can people find the book or find you, this website?
Right now, the book will be on Amazon, but I do have my own website, www.percybrown.com. That's a way to connect with me. Once the book releases, I'll be launching a podcast, and I'm going to name it after the book, Strength Through Generations. So that'll be a way to connect beyond the book, right? Because back to your point, I'm also trying to build community and raise awareness, right? I said that was my intent for the book. But when you write a book, the publisher and other people will tell you also have to have a podcast and a website. So you kind of are coming from different angles, right? But yeah, that's what I got going on, my friend.
I'm so glad you worked through those limitations that you had and held about being a writer to put this into the world. And I think back to that quote that you read us in the beginning about legacy, and the 3 words I jotted down were character, conviction, and compassion. And then you also mentioned a 4th C word, which was connection. And I just feel like this whole conversation, Percy, is an embodiment of those intentions and those values. And I'm so grateful for the time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and it was easy to get into that space, especially when you're with like-minded people. For the listeners, just in case you don't know, if you're ever considering redesigning your room or your office space, your feng shui, hey, you need to reach out to Betsy Delzer. She helped us out. When we were colleagues in the district, that was part of the work that we did. And honestly, I mean, even how this is kind of set up is based on some of the things that you've shared with me, and space is important. I'm just letting people know that you are talented in many ways.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
well,
there you go.
It all adds to the frequency.
That's right. You're absolutely right.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Percy.
All right. Thank you. You take care and have a blessed weekend, my friend.
By Firelight is a Lit Path Studios production and is produced by Jamie Gale and Betsy Delzer. Music is by Legito Music and Pond 5. Thank you for being a part of our beautiful collection of stories.